chun an lecht tosig ar inaugural lecture tonight ar achnamíocht agus go háirithe chun ceiliúra an talamh Carol Newman. Just a bhhailm of bhuichas a gháil as a prófist, I dús spáire Linda Doyle, ceann scoile chomh Paul O'Grady agus ceann na Ryan an seo, agus Dean Cumá agus muintear Carol, the family, Cumá sin na chomhlachtaí. Tásúla go minic sí teann as an ocáid de síalta agus inspiráid a nocht. It's a very, very special occasion. We've had 5 inaugurals this year. And for me personally, this is a very, very important occasion, Carol, because I've had the privilege of working with Carol over a number of years. And to see someone of the stature, the calibre, the quality, just of the all-roundedness of Carol being elevated to our very highest achievement in the university as a personal chair is just heartwarming for me personally. And I'm delighted to welcome here this evening your mother and father, Mary and Frank, we had a good chat, and your own partner, Roberto. Also delighted to see all the family members, and you all look very alike. I was able to pick them out of the crowd, so it's wonderful to have Claire and Rose and Fran and your brothers-in-law, of course, Ian and Peter, and your nephews, Reuben and Lachlan, and good luck with the exam on Friday. I almost got a free consultation because he's studying medicine. I was about to show him my injured hand. And Callie, of course, who's studying here with us. You're very good friends, I can see. Suzanne and Sarah, who are here with us. But very importantly to note, your PhD advisor, Professor Alan Matthews, but also your internal examiner, which is phenomenal. I see Alan, come down to the front. Mike Harrison, who taught you as an undergrad student, and it's just wonderful that you're here and remembered you well from your times as an undergrad and said, how could I not? And I mean, that, I think, sums it up for all of us. Very important as well, I did try to ask one person to leave. He's mentioned specifically, but he refused to go, unfortunately. Professor John O'Hagan. We have a long-standing, very good relationship. But anyway, so we're thrilled, seriously, to welcome John here this evening. It's been a great support and a mentor, as far as I'm aware, Carol, for yourself. Wonderful, again, to welcome Francis Rowan and Andrew Somerville here, retired colleagues. What I found very interesting is colleagues from all disciplines here this evening, throughout the university. I kind of was going around and saying, why are you here? And clearly, the whole field of econometrics. So I had a chat with 2 of your students up there, Thomas and Adam, who told me all about econometrics. I could hardly spell it, but anyway. And the language that's being used, and equally by one of your first students, Barry Harrington, is here. And everywhere you go, it's very impressive, like phenomenal. And you made econometrics apparently very entertaining, so all credit to you. But wonderful to see all our colleagues from the school here as well this evening, which is great. I suppose, to us really, who is the new professor, Carol Newman, in that context. And Carol is one of our own in Trinity, with your degrees coming from Trinity. But very impressive range of visiting professorships, University of Chicago, Copenhagen, Bologna, it's phenomenal. The list is quite extraordinary. I'm not going to go through them all, they're just at another level, but I want to identify a couple of the contributions, because this is really where someone who is elevated to the ranks of a personal chair in the university really shines. So you've been chair of the National Economic Dialogue for the Irish government. I mean, it's having influence and networks at that level is very, very important for the university. Chair of the Board of Partnership for Economic Policy, which is a Southern-led global organisation to support development in the global south. You're a consultant to the World Bank. My goodness, I actually didn't know where to start or stop. It's a Senior Research Fellow at the United Nations University, the World Institute for Development Economics Research. And I mean, the list of publications is extraordinary, all in leading academic journals, books, unedited volumes. But I suppose true to my own heart is where I really found synergies. Carol's research projects define who she is as a scholar, as an intellectual of the highest calibre in university, but as the human that is Carol. And I have known Carol as a person who always says yes. If you ask Carol, I've asked her so many things, and she's so sorry this year. We won't mention the war. But she has always, always, always gone over, beyond. It's unreal in terms of supporting each one of us, her colleagues. What I loved is the titles of your projects. So you have research projects like Leaving No One Behind, which is using role models to inspire enterprise activity amongst ethnic minority households in rural Vietnam. Projects called Nourish, which is to do with, supporting women who are living with HIV in clinics in Uganda. Projects to do with South Africa towards inclusive economic development. And I mean, all that builds on the work that you're co-founder of TIME, which is Trinity Impact Evaluation Unit, chair of the Trinity International Development Initiative, and champion, still are. I mean, that's incredible. Nobody does that, I promise, for that many years. Champion of International Development Research Theme in college from 2012 to date. Your heart is there, and your work, your scholarship, it really points to all of that. We're going to hear in a moment a little bit about Carol's work, but Carol is a very jolly person, great sense of humour. It belies, I think, just your absolute brilliance, but underneath, and I thought I would steal something from our esteemed colleague, sorry John, and you will know who we're talking about. An economics professor had a brilliant idea. He trained a parrot to say just one phrase: supply and demand. Impressed by the bird's apparent grasp of the most fundamental economic principle, the professor brought it to class and proudly introduced it as his new teaching assistant. Ask it anything, he said to the sceptical students, and the student raised her hand and said, what happens when prices go up? The parrot said, supply and demand. Another asked, what happens in a recession? Supply and demand. Frustrated, a third student muttered, that bird doesn't know anything else. And the professor smiled and said, exactly, it's ready for the evening news now. So, all joking aside, we are here to celebrate Carol. We're also here to listen and to learn from your achievements here this evening. And at the end, we really look forward for our colleagues to join us over in the common room and to have a more informal opportunity just to offer your own congratulations. So over to you, Professor Newman.
Oh, thank you very much, Carmel, for those words. They were a little bit overwhelming, but thank you. And it was a lovely introduction, and I'm delighted to see so many people here today, and also very delighted to have the Provost here and the Dean of Research here, to have so many of my PhD advisor, Alan Matthews, internal examiner, and so many of my retired colleagues here as well. So I'm delighted to see you all here. Also, a lot of my current colleagues from the department and from the school and from around college, you're very welcome here today. I've also got a number of co-authors in the audience, so I'll be talking about some of our work later on, so you'll feature in the presentations. Some of my PhD students are also here, some of my master's students that I've taught are also here, and I'm also delighted to have my family here as well. So I'll get started. So the title of my talk today is Against the Headwinds, and basically I want to talk about evidence-based development in a turbulent world. So I'm going to start with this picture, I think, which most people here will have seen before, or at least have heard of, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And these are the 17 goals adopted by the United Nations to end poverty, to protect the planet, and to ensure peace and prosperity by 2020. So they address the major global challenges of our time: inequality, climate change, access to education and health. So this is a kind of a universal roadmap, but they are under serious threat. And I think this is a picture that is quite stark. So basically progress has been uneven, progress has been slow, and as you'll see from this graph here, 35% of the goals have stagnated, or in fact, they have regressed. So global poverty has slowed to a near standstill. So the World Bank figures suggest that almost 700 million people are still living in extreme poverty, and that's less than $2.15 a day. So when you think about that, that's 8.5% of the global population. There were significant setbacks from COVID, from the war in Ukraine, from the climate change and climate crises, and these all affect the poorest and most vulnerable parts of the world to a greater extent than anywhere else in the world. The worst performing region in the world is Sub-Saharan Africa. And it's in Sub-Saharan Africa, which account for 16% of the world's population, but 67% of those who are living in extreme poverty. So the goals that are performing particularly badly are some of the ones that we really don't want to think about. Zero hunger. We have seen stagnation, regression in that goal. Quality education, decent work and economic growth, reduced inequalities, climate action. Now, what I want to talk about today is also a bit depressing, but hopefully things will get a bit more optimistic as we go through the talk. But there are growing headwinds, is what I would call them. So in particular, I think we all watched in horror in February as Elon Musk dismantled US aid. Aid from the US accounts for about 30% of global aid budgets. And there is no doubt this is going to have a significant real negative impact on the lives of people on the ground. I would call it in itself a humanitarian crisis. But this was a trend, this was a going trend, and aid has been slashed by many countries over the years. And I think the example of the UK aid budget now reaching only 0.3% of GDP, and that's likely to be a permanent fixture into the future. So aid is projected to fall by 50 billion by 2027. There's also the increased climate risks. This leads to frequent and severe disasters. And again, it's the most vulnerable that are affected by this. And declining aid budgets is just going to make that much harder for them to cope with. And another big crisis and big headwind is the move towards tariff hikes and trade wars. All of these hinder growth and hinder learning. Increased prices will lead to, reduced competition will lead to increased prices, and that's going to affect real incomes of people. It's going to increase the prices producers have to pay for their inputs, and overall it's going to limit innovation, prevent productivity growth, and prevent knowledge transfers. And that's kind of another headwind that we should be worried about. And layer on top of that the geopolitical tensions, the conflict and displacement, and really it's a pretty grim picture, and it's very, very unlikely that we will attain these SDGs by 2030. But what I would argue is that, designing the appropriate and effective policies to advance the Sustainable Development Goals has really never been more important. And what I want to do in today's talk is to demonstrate why building and using the right evidence base is fundamental to sustainable development. And I'm going to draw on my own research over the last number of years and that of my co-authors as well as I talk through this. So I've structured the lecture into three parts. So in the first part, I'll talk about the micro-foundations of development. And here I want to talk about how we can help the poorest and most marginalized in the world improve their income and their well-being. This is going to be the most substantive part of the talk. But I then want to talk a little bit about another area of my research, which has been about structural transformation, about firms and about jobs. And this is really talking about how we create the opportunities, economic opportunities, for people to work in decent jobs. And this will help to motivate, I guess, the unanswered questions, or that what I will be spending my next maybe 20 years doing research on over the next while. And that's like what the key questions are we should be asking when we think about these headwinds and when we take these headwinds into account. So I'll be taking you on a bit of a journey. So I'll be talking first about development at a very microeconomic level, and then I'll be turning to the more macro picture, thinking about economic growth and the engines of growth. And I'm also going to take you on a little bit of a global journey, take you through some of the countries that I've had the privilege of kind of working with, and people I've had the privilege of working with over the years. So to start with, thinking about the micro-foundations of development. So in this body of research, I aim to understand the barriers that individuals, households, or firms face in low-income countries in making their everyday decisions. So specifically thinking about the market and the government failures that affect the behaviour of people that hinder the development process. So what I want you to think about going through this is what the day-to-day life is like for the poorest and most vulnerable in the poorest parts of the world. So what's the lived reality reality on the ground in the villages and the cities and the neighbourhoods where they live. You know, this is where development ultimately happens, so we really need to think about what is happening on the ground there. So what are the binding constraints that they face, and how can policies be developed to alleviate those constraints? So the main tool that we use in this research, in this body of research, the main tool that I've used and we use in the Trinity Impact Evaluation Unit that the Dean mentioned earlier, is a randomised control trial. And really, randomised control trials have revolutionised the field of development economics. Essentially, in a nutshell, they work very much like a clinical trial, so where a population of interest is randomly assigned to either receive a policy or an intervention, or they're not. And those who don't get the intervention, they're treated as a control group, and they serve as a counterfactual for testing the impact. So if the programme works, then everybody benefits. It can be rolled out to the control group and the broader population. But what's very important about testing these types of interventions with the randomised control trial is that we learn lessons about how programmes work. We learn lessons about whether they work, and sometimes they don't work. And we often get very surprising results from these trials. And that's to the benefit of everybody, so we can make more efficient policy designs in the future. So today I'm going to present 5 case studies, just high level. I'm not going into too much detail about any of them, but to just give a flavour of the type of work that I've been involved in that really has tried to understand these micro-foundations of development that I spoke about. And the first relates to women living with HIV in Uganda, and the Dean mentioned this in her introduction. So in this project, to motivate why this was a very important research question for us to tackle, there's 25.6 million people living with HIV in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's 2/3 of the global total. And around 60% of new infections are women and children. And this is particularly the case in Uganda, which is the setting for this study. There's over 1.4 million people living with HIV in Uganda, and 860,000 of those are women. These are also a very vulnerable group of women. A lot of them are single parents and have children to also look after. Now, when we think about HIV, the HIV disease now, we often don't think about it as a killer disease in the way we used to. And this is due to huge advances in treatment, with widespread access to antiretroviral treatments. Across the developing world, individuals can live really full and active lives even when they're diagnosed as positive. But in many sub-Saharan African countries, there are other barriers that people face, and in particular women face, aside from having the disease itself. First of all, there's the physical burden of the disease. So living with HIV, it requires very careful management of your health. And there's many women that struggle with poor nutrition, and this weakens their immune systems, reduces the effectiveness of the antiretroviral treatments that they're on. And also there's a mental burden of the disease. There's a huge social stigma attached with being a woman with HIV in Uganda. And this discourages women from seeking treatment. It discourages them from disclosing their status, or even, I guess, daring to imagine that they can fully participate in society. So this raises the question, and the question we asked was, how can we improve the welfare of this vulnerable group? So together with Guy Narciso, my colleague in economics here, who's in the audience, and others across the university, we embarked on a project called Nourish. And this was an Irish aid-funded project. And the particular arm of that project that we looked at was trying to address the issues of body and mind in relation to these women living with HIV. So what we did was we designed a multi-armed experiment, a randomised control trial, to investigate this issue. We worked with agronomists and nutritionists in rural Uganda to develop a recipe for a locally sourced food that women could easily make themselves at home, using ingredients that they could grow or ingredients that they could buy. And we designed a basic nutrition information campaign around that. So we had flyers and posters that we put up in the clinics with the women, where we actually visited the clinics and we talked with them as they were waiting for their appointments to get their antiretroviral treatments. So that first arm of the experiment was this information campaign, simple type of information campaign. But then we had a second arm of the experiment, which was cookery demonstrations. So basically, as the women were waiting for their treatments, we had a cookery demonstration, an interactive cookery demonstration, where we taught them how to make the food, and they could taste it, and it was a very kind of social event. And then third, we had, in terms of addressing kind of the mindsets of these women, we found these 4 wonderful women that we call the inspiring women, and their pictures are up there. And these are women who are living with HIV and who have made businesses for themselves, who have lifted themselves out of poverty. And we shot 4-minute videos of each of these women who told their story. And we screened these videos in the clinics while the women were waiting for their treatments, and really just to illustrate that, you know, for them to be inspired and to illustrate that you can actually live very full lives when you're living with the disease. So the results were, I think they tell a powerful story. So first of all, the information campaign, it improved nutritional intake and it improved health. The cookery demonstrations also improved nutritional intake and health. So these were results that we expected. The role models were inspirational. We saw increases in incomes. We saw more women opening their own businesses and overall their welfare improving. But there was a surprising finding, and a very positive surprising finding, something that we weren't expecting. And that was that the cookery demonstrations themselves also played a very inspirational role. It encouraged women to invest in business. They became healthier. They became more economically active. They started small businesses. They started to earn more income. So the lesson was clear in this case, that addressing poverty and marginalisation, it requires more than information. You get so far with just giving information. In this case, it really demonstrated that it also required empowerment. The next vulnerable group I want to talk about are ethnic minorities in Vietnam. So there has been rapid growth in Vietnam over the last 3 decades. When I first started working in Vietnam was back in 2006, and the streets of Hanoi were kind of half and half bicycles and scooters. Then a few years later, going back to do field work, was mainly scooters everywhere. And then the last time I was there, back in about 2017, the streets were full of cars. So kind of really illustrated that very rapid economic progress that Vietnam has gone through. But there's growing inequality, and especially along ethnic lines. And the ethnic minority groups, they account for about 14% of the population of Vietnam, but they live in persistent poverty, and they live in the remote areas of Vietnam, the disaster-prone areas, and in total, there's about 53 different ethnic minority groups officially recognised across Vietnam. So inspired by the project in Uganda, Gaia Narciso and myself asked the question of whether successful role models could help inspire the ethnic minorities in these communities. And here we also thought about the fact that these are ethnic minorities. They might not, the identity of who the role model is might actually matter quite a lot. So we also thought about whether or not the relatability of the role model mattered. So in this case, we designed a three-armed treatment, or a three-armed randomised controlled trial, and this work was together with Finn Tarp, another long-term co-author of mine from University of Copenhagen. We tested the effects of inspirational videos featuring ethnic minority role models. That's our first picture up there. This is an ethnic minority who, again, had made a business for themselves and was happy to share their story with other people to say, you can do this too. We also had an ethnic majority role model who was an actor that played the part that the ethnic minority role model played. And we had a placebo treatment also in this case, and a control group. We followed 800 households in 88 communes in northern Vietnam over the course of a year. This is where these households were based, so up in the very northwest part of Vietnam. So it's a very rural, remote part of the country. And after the first screening of the first video, we followed them, we surveyed them after about 3 months after that, and we saw an immediate increase in aspirations, just for those who had seen the ethnic minority group. And they also began to diversify their incomes. They began to diversify away from subsistence agricultural activities towards starting new businesses. So we thought this was a very, very positive type of finding to begin with. However, this is one of the villages, beautiful villages that we visited up there. There was some very surprising findings. At the end of the year, after they'd seen all 3 videos, after a full year had passed, unfortunately we found that the ethnic role model, the people who had attended that screening, had actually had a shock to their income. They were negatively affected by the exposure to these role model videos. And this was entirely driven by exposure to shocks. This is a picture of Gaia and myself on the road in Vietnam, where we were about to head to visit one of the villages, and there was a landslide across the road, just to illustrate. And it was, while we were there, actually, I think we had 2 landslides and an earthquake, and it was my first time experiencing an earthquake, so it was quite a remarkable field trip that we had undertaken. But just to illustrate the extent of the conditions that these households were living in. So our takeaway from it was that, inspiration alone was not enough. So encouraged by these inspirational videos, these people moved out of these stable subsistence activities into riskier businesses. And these riskier businesses, they didn't have the financial resilience to weather shocks. So when disaster struck, these households actually suffered more as a result of that. So really, without addressing kind of the underlying vulnerabilities facing these communities, even with the best intentions, people can be left worse off. So a key lesson from this study was that social protection and risk mitigation, they're kind of the key inputs here. You need that basic stuff there first before you can take development to another level. The other key thing, takeaway from this, is that context matters. So what worked in one context with a vulnerable group just didn't translate to this other context. A more recent project that I want to talk about deals with another very vulnerable group, highly vulnerable group, and this is refugees and internally displaced people, especially those who are internally displaced and are refugees in the poorest countries of the world. Designing interventions in these cases is very, very complex. And the particular region that we focus on in this project is conflict and crises in the Sahel region of Africa. And conflict and crises in this region has displaced millions. And the particular country context that we focus on here is Niger, which is one of the poorest countries in the world already. It ranks almost bottom of the Human Development Index. And it's actually host to 800,000 forcibly displaced people. So you've got these forcibly displaced people who are living in camps, but in communities and trying to integrate into host communities that are already extremely poor. So that makes things quite complex in terms of figuring out what's going to work in these settings. So the question we ask in this project is, well, what if we target supports at both the forcibly displaced and the host populations? In this work, this is joint work with Tara Mitchell, who's here in the audience as well. And in this experiment, we partnered with the World Bank, and we want to test the impact of an entrepreneurial support program. And this entrepreneurial support program is targeted at both the refugees and the host communities. Our analysis is based in 220 communities in the Diffa region of Niger. And when we did our baseline survey, it really painted a very grim picture. 88% of the people in our baseline had no education, 75% had recently run out of food, and there was a very high risk of depression in our baseline survey. So this is really, really poor context and a very, very difficult context. The program itself it's a World Bank program, and the program involved dispersing cash grants of $200, which is a significant amount of money to individuals in these communities. So it's about a third of the GDP per capita of Niger. And with that came business training. So they were trained in how to grow micro-enterprises, trained in kind of some life skills, some soft skills training. And to receive the grant, you really just had to have a business idea. You didn't really have to have much follow-through as a result of that. It was a staggered implementation. The program was being implemented everywhere, but it was a staggered implementation because of capacity constraints, because of resource constraints. So we could use a randomized controlled trial because we could randomize which communities got the intervention first. So half of them received the program earlier, and when I say earlier, I mean 3 months earlier. And within those communities, there was a quota as to how many people could get the grant. So we ran a public lottery to select who could get the program. So what we can analyse here using this setup is short-term effects. So it's only 3 months after the intervention, what do we see as a result of that? Well, really, the effects were very positive short-term. And I guess this is not that surprising because it's a huge amount of money being injected into a community. But what we see 3 months later is that those who got the program relative to the control group, they had an increase in economic activities, more agricultural related livelihoods. We saw positive effects on their expenditures. They were spending more on food, on clothing, on utilities. Their incomes increased, and they had a reduced reliance on credit, a reduced reliance on loans. And there was positive effects for both the refugees and the host communities, which was also quite a reassuring and a positive result. But again, like in the previous two experiments, there were some surprising findings. And I stress again, that at least in the short term, what can we say, what happened in the community? First of all, there was a very desirable surprising finding, which was that there was major spillovers. So even those who didn't get the programme also experienced increases in their income and increases in their livelihoods. But there was some undesirable effects. We saw negative effects on psychological well-being. We saw greater exposure to economic shocks and greater crime. And we saw increased conflict between the host and the refugee communities over scarce resources. So this is kind of an undesirable effect that we didn't expect to find as a result of the programme. So the key takeaway from this is that economic support programs can really boost incomes in fragile settings, but it can also trigger these unintended social effects. And there's a case then to be made for complementary interventions relating to mental health support, relating to community engagement. They can also play an important role. So this is a very early project, and the results are not published yet. But I think they do give this a very important picture, particularly when we put it in the context of the fact that 75% of the world's displaced population are hosted in poor countries. So these are the issues that matter there. Another kind of vulnerability that many people face in the world, particularly in the poorest countries of the world, relates to climate risk. So 23% of the world population faces significant risk of flooding, and 89% of those are in the low and middle income parts of the world. So rising floods and unseasonal rains, poor drainage systems, they turn neighbourhoods, particularly in urban areas, into hazard zones. So you have damage to property, you have school closures, you have increased risk of waterborne illnesses. And despite the fact that there have been investments in drainage infrastructure in lots of cities around the world, a key component of the functioning of those that infrastructure is the maintenance of the infrastructure itself. So maintaining the clean and functional public spaces, it's a collective challenge, and this is a typical public goods problem as we talk about in economics. The benefits are shared, but the responsibility often feels like it's no one's to bear. So in this context, a question that we asked in this project based in Dakar in Senegal is how can we mobilise communities to engage in the maintenance and improvement of public infrastructure. So in a recent study, together again with Tara Mitchell, my colleague in economics here, we worked with the World Bank to develop an intervention that could work in terms of encouraging communities to engage in maintaining their local infrastructure. We worked in two peri-urban areas of Dakar, Peking and Guidoua, which house 12% of the population of Senegal, so very densely populated areas that are built in a flood risk area, essentially. So we worked with 160 neighbourhoods, about 2,400 households in this area, and we designed an intervention called Operation Clean Neighbourhood, or Opération Quartier Propre, so excuse the French accent there. We worked through existing community-based organisations, and we provided small incentives to these community organisations, such as cleaning supplies, T-shirts, these kinds of things. And we tasked them with the challenge of maintaining their neighbourhoods or keeping their neighbourhoods clean. So they had kind of a score sheet that they had to reach, and if they met a cleanliness threshold, they were rewarded with a public recognition ceremony, basically a reward. So some of you might be thinking this sounds familiar, and yes, we did base it on the Irish Tidy Towns competitions. So at the end of this year, 1 year later, we found really big effects. So we found that they were more likely to report their neighbourhood as clean, they were less likely to experience flooding, and significantly, they were also less likely to report illness, especially illness from malaria. So the key takeaway for this was, it's again related to kind of empowerment. So empowering local groups with recognition and small supports can really unlock this collective action for the public good. I think this paper is a really good example of leveraging the power of local communities in development efforts. The final randomised controlled trial I want to talk about before moving on to the second part of my talk is an agricultural economics one. I thought I had to put this in because my supervisor is here and I started out as an agricultural economist. So in this experiment, we're talking about agriculture and we're talking about productivity growth. So low agricultural productivity among smallholder farmers is a major challenge across the developing world, and it's a major inhibitor to the structural transformation process. And agriculture is the backbone of Ethiopia's economy, and it's essential for food security. So Ethiopia is the setting for this study. But farmers, they're facing declining soil fertility and stagnating yields. And one of the reasons for this, among many reasons, but one of the reasons is because of suboptimal fertilizer use. So in this project, we asked the question of how can we encourage farmers to use the right amount of fertilizer for their crops? A seemingly simple question, but actually quite a complex question in many ways. There are two issues with fertilizer use in Ethiopia. First of all, the government give blanket fertilizer recommendations. So they say you should use this amount of fertilizer without any knowledge of the crop type, any knowledge of the soil type. So it's information that's not really used by farmers and not really trusted by farmers. And secondly, it's very risky to invest in fertilizer because if you have any kind of natural disaster, any kind of agricultural shock, and your crop fails, you've made this very big upfront investment in your fertilizer usage. So this raised two critical questions for us. The first one was, what if we actually develop a tool where we can give site-specific fertilizer recommendations, so a farmer can know exactly how much fertilizer they should apply, exactly what the yield will be if they apply it, and exactly when to apply it. And also, what would it be like if we actually also offered crop insurance? So we offered an insurance to the farmers that if their crop failed, they would get the equivalent of the returns in terms of income. Would that increase their probability of investing in fertilizer? So to answer this question, Helemere Mayal, who's a postdoc with me here, was a postdoc with me here, is now at IFPRI, and Jordan Chamberlain from CIMMIT, we worked together to develop this randomized controlled trial where we worked with 130 communities in Ethiopia, 738 farmers, and these are all maize producers. And the first treatment was this tailored fertilizer recommendation, this new kind of product that was developed with CIMMIT, and that's Haley there actually testing the soil to figure out how much fertilizer should be used. The second treatment was the same tailored recommendations, but we also worked with the local insurance company to provide crop insurance to the farmers. We offered them the product for free to see what their behaviour, how their behaviour would change as a result of that. And also we had a control group. The results were striking. So this information actually led farmers to change the amount of fertilizer that they were using. It not only led farmers, so basically they adjusted their fertilizer levels to the recommended levels. So those that were kind of under-applying fertilizer increased their fertilizer usage, but also those that were over-applying or over-investing reduced their fertilizer usage. So it was a much more efficient use of fertilizer. And at the end of this harvest season, they also had a significant increase in yields, about 20% higher than the control, and their profits also increased. So a very simple intervention that led to these very big changes. But again, here there was a very surprising finding. Actually, coupling the information with the insurance had no additional effect. So the insurance didn't make any difference to the farmers. They responded in the same way to the information, but they didn't respond to the insurance. So the key takeaway from this was the lack of knowledge was the key constraint. So by using a randomized controlled trial, we could see that it's really just lack of knowledge in this context and wasn't a fear of risk that was the main constraint. And providing relevant information tailored to local realities is a cost-effective way to promote technology adoption. So bringing these kind of set of micro development studies together, so thinking about what the key takeaways are, and I guess across all of these different vulnerable communities in different settings, urban settings and rural settings and stable settings and fragile settings, the big question is how do we empower people, I think, to improve their lives and livelihoods when they face this constant uncertainty, be it from poverty, social inclusion, rising climate risks. And I think some of the common findings to bring out from this is that in all of these cases, people responded, and they responded to new ideas and new opportunities, but they responded when they were relevant and they responded when they were actionable. The other key takeaway, I think, is that the results that we find, they're not always as expected. So as was in all cases, we found surprising results and sometimes really significantly worrying results, such as in the case of the Vietnam and also in the case of Niger. And I think this really highlights the complexity of development and the need to fully understand the underlying mechanisms. Another point just to make here is that all of our interventions worked with local institutions, so working with local partners who knew the ground, who knew the situation of people on the ground, and developing the interventions in partnership with them. And also, I think they illustrate that these are not just academic exercises, and we learn a lot about economic behaviour through these exercises, but we also learn a lot about policy. So important to me is that they're also very policy relevant. So I think that hopefully what I've illustrated there is that these RCTs, they provide a crucial evidence base for developing policies that can be implemented at the micro level to help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And going back to the declining overseas development aid budgets, I think now more than ever, it's important to know what will work and why it will work, so that the best use of these funds can be made. So now I want to go to kind of the other extreme and think about development from a much broader perspective. And on the one hand, we have these micro-level interventions that will lead to behavioural change through the various mechanisms we spoke about. But on the other side, we need to think about the economic environment that people are living in. So what is happening in the broader economy? So are there economic opportunities for these people? How can we create these opportunities? And again, going back to the declining aid budgets, the capacity of the state and the private sector to provide these opportunities is actually key and going to be key for the foreseeable future. So to talk about structural transformation, in economics, it's something that we talk about a lot in development economics. So what is structural transformation? So essentially it involves the economy moving from low-income subsistence activities to higher value-added activities in the industrial sector and in the services sector. So it's kind of a long-standing view in economics that this type of structural transformation is fundamental for development. And you can see it actually enshrined in lots of the SDGs. So the SDG on decent work and economic growth, the SDG on industry and innovation, all kind of enshrine this idea. But for this to work, there needs to be a productive private industrial sector. So to have structural transformation, there must be jobs for people to go to. And it's certainly the case that over the last 30 years, manufacturing has shifted to developing countries, but that's mainly been to Asia. In 2022, Asia contributed 55% of global manufacturing value added, whereas Africa contributed only about 2%. And industry matters because it creates jobs, it creates good jobs, and it helps people move out of poverty. And it drives long-term economic growth. And we talk about industry here, I like to talk about it as industry without smokestacks. So it doesn't have to have smokestacks. Industry could mean tech, it could mean financial services, it could mean any of these types of sectors in the economy. But what's crucial, the crucial point here is that Africa is missing out on that crucial kind of job-creating stage of development. So my research interest in this area began well over a decade ago with a project called Learning to Compete, on which I was one of the principal investigators. And basically there was two questions that we asked. First was, why is there so little industry in Africa? And also, what can be done about it? So our approach to this was to do country case studies to begin with of 11 different countries. We covered 9 countries in Africa and 2 in Southeast Asia. And we tackled it looking at it from a firm perspective, so thinking about firm-level productivity and what are the drivers of firm-level productivity growth. There was 50 academic papers produced from this project, not all by me, some of them by me, and we produced 1 edited volume there and 1 book. This was the first edited volume was a set of the collection of all of the case studies that talk about industrialization and what happened in each of these countries, so it's kind of a useful reference point for that. And then we had a more kind of accessible non-academic book called Made in Africa, Learning to Compete in Industry. I want to just highlight some key findings from this and then kind of use it to motivate kind of my future research agenda more than anything else. So as I said, we focused on private sector development, and the key areas that we were interested in looking at were the importance of skills of workers and managers, The importance of export markets, so the importance of entering export markets. We're very interested in looking at exposure to foreign direct investment. We were very interested in looking at the role of special economic zones. And the comparative perspective that we took was very, very useful within this, because not only did we do case studies, but we did similar empirical analysis in all of these countries where we could find the data. So we could actually do a very good comparison of these drivers. And universally, I think I can summarize it by saying the experience in sub-Saharan Africa was very different to Southeast Asia, which is not that surprising, but also very different to northern parts of Africa. Some of the key differences were the significant skills deficit in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, which I don't think is a major surprise. In terms of thinking about export markets, we found that many firms were born global. So when we think about firm productivity growth, we often think about them entering export markets as that kind of step where they're becoming more productive. They learn from that and become even more productive after that and grow further. This is not what was happening in many sub-Saharan African countries. Domestic firms were setting up as exporters, so they already had those skills. The domestic firms were not graduating to a stage of being able to compete on export markets. We also found that the foreign direct investment, the FDI, was not linked into the local economy in any way. We did a number of studies in all of these countries, and in Vietnam we found significant linkages across the economy. So multinational companies were buying inputs from domestic suppliers, they were selling goods to downstream domestic producers, and overall it was creating this really great productivity environment for productivity growth. In Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, when we tried to do the same exercise, we just found no linkages whatsoever. The FDI firms were working in enclaves and were not linked with the local economy. And then we had special economic zones. We found that they were functioning very poorly. They were not linked in with the local economy, but I think above all, they were very poorly managed and very poorly regulated. I remember one story, which is a funny story, but not that funny, was in Tanzania, where we were surveying special economic zones and firms within special economic zones, and we had a register of firms that were supposed to be in that zone, and when we went there, none of them were actually there. It was empty. So I think that highlights the extent of the regulatory channels that were there. So these are kind of all the takeaways from this, and I think just to kind of bring it back to the Irish context, anybody who's, everybody here, I'm sure is familiar with the Irish growth experience, and I think if you look at these, we tick the box on all of these when we think of the Irish growth experience since the 1970s. So investment in skills, opening up the economy, attracting FDI, linking that FDI with the local economy, and then building industrial clusters. So we did all of those and it worked for us. So why is it not working in Africa? So the key challenges in an African context are, first of all, the political economy challenges that I've spoke about. There's limited state capacity to raise revenue. So a lot of these economies are informal economies. There's a very low tax base, so raising revenue is a big issue. There's chronic underinvestment in education, and now, on top of that, we have a much more protectionist environment, and trade will impact on that. Two other constraints or challenges that I want to mention here are labour markets and private sector development. And these are two areas that will really be the focus of my research agenda, currently are, and will continue to be the focus of my research agenda in the coming years. So in the last few minutes, I want to talk a little bit about some of these unanswered questions and what we're trying to do to answer these questions. And the first thing I want to talk about are labour markets in Africa and present a few facts about these labour markets, because to me it's clear that this is one of the major challenges facing the continent. Africa's labour force is growing rapidly. By 2030, 230 to 450 million new workers will enter the labour force. By 2050, 1 in every 3 people who start looking for their first job will be born in Africa. So where are these jobs going to come from if we have this lack of a private sector development and all of these constraints in terms of competing that I spoke about from my previous research? When we think about labour markets in Africa, they also behave very differently to the labour markets that we're used to. So when we think about how our own career progression happens, when we switch jobs, that's the time in our career that we get a wage boost. That's the time in our career that we get a kind of a better job, a more productive job. But in Africa, that's not what happens. You see very frequent job transitions. So people move in and out of jobs very, very quickly. Short-term contracts, precarious contracts, that's the dominant type of contract that's there. You also see very frequent unemployment spells. So workers move in and out of employment very frequently, move in and out of the informal sector very, very frequently. And also what you see is that when moving jobs, they often fall down the job ladder or fall off the job ladder. So they don't get a wage boost or get a better job, they often get a worse job. So what I'm interested in understanding is what is driving this. So what are the key challenges? So there's two areas of research that I'm pursuing. One is helping workers retain jobs and move up the job ladder, particularly for low-skilled workers. And another is creating employment opportunities, so thinking about private sector development. So in relation to the first, I think there's a huge opportunity in Africa in relation to creating jobs through the fact that there's such a huge infrastructure deficit. So there is significant infrastructure investment needed, and building these projects is going to require a lot of low-skilled labour. So really it has the potential to generate significant employment. But while these jobs might not require high levels of education, they do demand a lot of other skills, a lot of other soft skills. They demand reliability, they demand diligence. And you know, a lot of the simple roles we think about, such as being a security guard, for example, requires a lot of kind of conscientious behaviours. So you need to show up at time, you need to stay alert, and so on and so forth. And conscientiousness is the topic of a paper that is currently coming out in Review of Economics and Statistics that looks at conscientiousness being a strong predictor of workplace success, but what we are trying to see is whether it can be changed and can it actually be changed in people. It's one of the big five, so we often think about these things as being unchangeable, but can it actually be taught in a way, and can it improve labour market outcomes? So in work together with Martina Kirchberger from the Department of Economics here also, we did an experiment on conscientiousness training in the workplace. So it was a randomised control trial with 386 low-skilled workers who were employed to build the rapid express train. And that's the finished express train. So this project happened a few years ago. And basically, we worked with two psychologists, one in Zurich and one in the University of Illinois. And again, this is a World Bank project, a World Bank funded project. And we adapted a training intervention called the Soft Skills Training for Improved Mindset that's been used in other contexts, but we adapted it to the Senegalese context. And basically, it was a very simple training intervention. So with the workers, we had a 2-hour interactive workshop that was focused on building kind of conscientious workplace habits. And we also had 8 weeks of phone reminders following up from that, reminding workers to be conscientious and so on and so forth. So I won't go into the details of the experiment, but just to say that after 9 months, we found very powerful results. So the workers that were trained in conscientious behaviours, they had higher job retention, so they were much more likely to still be working at the firm, and they also earned 23% higher than a control group. And that included workers who had subsequently left the firm and gone on to new jobs. So I think this is one of the first studies that I know of to show that even a brief, low-cost psychological intervention can improve employment outcomes for low-skilled workers in Africa. And in this line of research, our ongoing work looks really at, you know, is there potential with these infrastructure jobs? What we want to look at is to see whether when someone receives a job on one of these construction projects, are they really a good job? Is it a job that people want? And does receiving one of these jobs actually lead to better labour market outcomes? Does it allow these workers move up the job ladder as they move through their career? And in this project, we've partnered with a Chinese construction company, and this company is building the rapid bus express infrastructure in Dakar. And in this case, we had the opportunity to randomise the job offers from the pool of applicants who applied, so we can really test the impact over the longer term. And we're combining this randomised control trial with a high-frequency survey to explore what it really means to receive a job on one of these construction projects. Does it really improve the labour market outcomes of workers? So the results will be coming on that later on this year. The other final area I want to talk about in relation to the key challenge is really about private sector development and creating employment opportunities. And one of the major projects that have been part of my research agenda for a while is my project in South Africa towards inclusive economic development. So SA Tide is the name of the project. And this is a flagship research and policy partnership between National Treasury in South Africa, the South African Revenue Service, and UNU Wider. And our goal is to produce high-quality, policy-relevant research that directly informs South Africa's strategies for achieving inclusive and sustainable growth. And the key resource we have here, which is key to the thing that pins all of this project together, is the tax administrative data. So it doesn't sound so exciting, probably not as exciting as a randomized controlled trial, but I'm really, really excited about it. So basically, this is all of the tax records, all of the records that are kept by the South African Revenue Service. Company tax records, PAYE tax records, VAT returns, customs data. We also have public procurement data. And a major part of the project is that we have built a data lab in National Treasury in South Africa to house all of this data, link it all together and make it used so that researchers can use it. Researchers from all over South Africa, researchers from all over the world can use it. So that's kind of the major kind of infrastructure investment that we made in this project. And one of the critical pillars, and that's actually the view from in Pretoria from where our lab is based. That's I think that's the Federal Reserve Bank in the background there. So this is a work stream that I lead together with John Rand, another long-term co-author of mine from the University of Copenhagen. And basically what we're interested in is job creation and enterprise development, so that kind of second part of my research agenda. And the context of South Africa is hugely interesting. Unemployment is 33% there, and youth unemployment is 60%. So in that kind of context, jobs, it's all about jobs, how to create jobs, and how to grow the private sector. So what we're interested in doing is identifying concrete evidence-based policies to expand employment and stimulate entrepreneurship. So we have a number of different themes, a number of different papers that we've worked on. We are working on the dynamics of the South African labour market, so thinking about this transition between jobs, how workers move between jobs, the kind of firms that they go to, whether they're moving up the job ladder and what that looks like. We have a paper on tariffs and productivity that has just recently come out, and that's co-authored with Bruno Morando, who is at Maynooth University, who is also here, I think. We are looking at the impact of mining activities on the localised spillovers from mining activities in these regions. We're also doing work on public procurement and its effectiveness, and we are some very early stage astonishing results from that will be coming out soon. And also a very interesting project looking at the understanding the long-term impact of apartheid, and that's co-authored with Marvin Swees from the Department of Economics here in Talent Nesongano, another of our PhD students. So I think that this is just kind of a flavour of the themes that we're working on there. But I think what's important about this work stream really is that it doesn't just produce academic papers, it's really kind of deeply embedded in the policy process. So we're working with the key institutions, the key policymakers, with National Treasury, with the Department of Trade and Industry and Competition, with the Presidency. And so the research is kind of directly informing the policy advice that comes. So again, the results are all pretty early stage here, but it'll be coming soon. So my future work, I think, in this space, if we look a little bit more longer term, is to really harness the power of these tax administrative data sets to understand development processes. And I think doing that and complementing that with randomized controlled trials that really get at the micro foundations of development and really understand the behavioural processes that underlie it is kind of a key area of future research where key learning can happen. And I think in any of this research and in designing this research, we really have to be mindful of the headwinds that we're facing. Again, going back to the fact that these protectionist policies make private sector development much more difficult. The climate crisis means that we can't just have growth without thinking about the impact on the environment. So any growth that we have needs to be sustainable. Also, we need to build state capacity for revenue generation. So in the face of aid cuts, building the state capacity is really, really crucial. And these types of databases are a hugely powerful resource in terms of achieving that. So to conclude, well, first of all, I want to thank you all for sticking with me through this journey. So I've taken you on quite a long journey, a very quick journey, but a long journey around the world through the various parts of my research. And I think I can summarise my research to date in two big questions. So how do we empower people to improve their lives, and how do we build economies where they can thrive? And I think my 20 years of research in this space has shown, I think, that development is really, really messy. It's really, really complex, and it's definitely non-linear, very much like my research path. But it's becoming even more challenging, and I think that's something that we have to really bear in mind. But I think progress is possible, and it's possible by basing our policy decisions on solid evidence that reflect the context, by learning what works, how it works, and why it works, and by harnessing the power of data, sometimes data that already exists, there's huge data resources that are out there to conduct rigorous data-driven policy analysis. So I'll leave on this kind of thinking of mine, which is that evidence, I believe, is the compass that will guide us through the headwinds in this turbulent world. So thank you for listening.